Lakeland Currents, your public affairs program for North Central Minnesota. Production funding for Lakeland Currents is made possible by Bemidji Regional Airport, serving the region with daily flights to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. More information available at bemidjiairport.org. Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is sponsored by Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Online at nisswatax.com.
Hello, welcome to Lakeland Currents. I'm Carl Sewell. Tonight, we're talking about libraries. For generations, libraries have been stable institutions at the core of our communities, places where information is found, meetings are held, and books are borrowed. In recent years, however, libraries have been adapting to the dramatic upheavals in the media environment. Printed books and periodicals are no longer people's main sources for information. Nowadays, students and citizens look online first for the information they need. So what role do libraries play in this new environment? And how are northern Minnesota's libraries faring in the 21st century? Joining me tonight are two guests. Patrick Leeport is an assistant professor of library services at Bemidji State University, and Kathy Enger is the executive director of the Northern Lights Library Network. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's nice to be here.
Yeah, to start off tonight, Kathy, why don't you tell us a little bit, what is the Northern Lights Library Network to people who aren't familiar with that?
Northern Lights Library Network serves all libraries within the Northern Lights region. And the region covers about a third of the state. So we work with academic libraries, school libraries, special libraries, and public libraries. We're an administrative layer between all types so that we can bring all library resources together and share those resources so that we can reduce duplication of services. We are always there if a library necessarily is in trouble. And we've had some libraries throughout the region in recent years that have been in trouble, that have closed and are reopening without expertise for reopening those libraries. So,
Are those closures, do you think, partly because of the changes
Yes.
and the needs that the public have, and maybe libraries
Yes.
haven't kept up with those?
Primarily, the closings have happened in school libraries.
Oh.
And the reason for that is because there's been a reduction in funds at the local level and at the state level. And also people misperceive the fact that everything can be found on the internet. And we know that's not true because I've done extensive research on the role that school librarians play in schools. They provide information literacy skills, digital literacy skills, and library and information science skills. So those schools that have closed their libraries are reopening them because reading scores have gone down.
Oh.
And so a library and a human being that reads books and distributes books represents books to students.
Yeah.
And therefore, students are drawn to this person in this place and end up reading more and actually doing better with
And
reading.
that leads into my next question, which is, if I have a Google, why do I need a library? To a little background on this, to me there seems like there's some overlap between the role and the function of this one megalithic company in particular and the historical role that libraries have played in accessing information.
Sure. So working at institution of higher education, we have the old card catalogs, if you remember those back in the day. We still have them in the library. They're not
next
functional.
to the buggy whips.
Right. They're not functional, but students kind of say, oh, that's the old Google, right? That's how you used to find information. And to some extent, right, that's how information every day was found before. Now you go on Google and you find different sorts of information, right? You can Google what time a local restaurant's open. Google's good at providing information, and if a librarian comes along and says, don't use Google, don't use Wikipedia, it sounds curmudgeonly, right? We're old sticklers that want you to check out books, and that's not the case. Information that's in libraries and information in Google is just two different animals, right? Each information need has a specific sort of information that lines up with it. So really looking to match an information need that you might come across at a university or a public college versus, what time's the restaurant open are two very different information needs. And I think there is a place for both, and I think both are welcome, but they're just meeting different needs.
That's true for the moment, but I know, to stay with Google in particular, they have their sights on much more than just when the restaurant's open,
Sure.
or that particular discrete data point that you might want to ask your phone for.
Yeah.
Google wants all the information in the world. They want all the books in the world. You know, Google Books has already cataloged, I think they're getting close to half of all the books that have ever been printed in the history of the world in all languages, making them digital and accessible to Google users.
Right.
So Google might be more than just that, but there still is the role for libraries. And beyond looking up an academic source or that kind of thing, which is behind a paywall, which students might have access to.
Right.
What is with this access issue?
Well, interestingly, the core of democracy, the core of our country, is based on copyright. And it's the reason why Google is so successful. So if I publish something, the rights either belong to the publisher. If I self-publish, they belong to me. But initially, when I create something, it belongs to me. And that's the case with everything that's created in the United States. So when I go to publish an article, I give up my rights to that article to the publishing company that is going to publish that article. And the same is true with books. So people give up their right to the publishing agency. Now, Google was in trouble for a while. I don't think any longer, but the copyright issue was a problem for Google at one point. You can't just take something.
I think it was more like the phantom authors thing within copyright, is that they couldn't, they had such a massive number that there was this small percentage, but it ended up being a huge number of authors who needed to be compensated, who they couldn't locate, who were either no longer alive, didn't have an estate, or that kind of thing.
Right, but you have to, if something's intellectual property, it belongs to the owner or it belongs to the agency that purchases it. And so, so there is that core belief in a democratic government that people who produce something actually own it to begin with until they give up their right.
For a limited time. And this
for 60 years, isn't it?
Well, currently it's 70 years after the death of the author, which is not at all in line with, you said at the core of our country, and the copyright clause in the Constitution just says, off the top of my head, it's about for scientific works, for it's not so much for art or those kinds of things, but it's for inventions and the useful arts. It says that copyright should be secured for a limited time, and that was first interpreted to be something like 7 to 10 years total.
Yes, but
basically the first print run of a book, and then it would go to public domain.
Yes, and now we have electronic publishing.
Yeah.
And Minnesota has something called the Minnesota Digital Library, which is an amazing institution. They take paper text and make it electronic and make it available to people. And then there's also there's the Digital Public Library of America. And New York Public has a digital publication process, but they have to be very careful to follow the copyright law, because there may still be people that are alive, or families may own the copyright for those 70 years after somebody passes away. So in our world, people that digitize things are very careful not to take something that already belongs to somebody else. And so we always look for, we have good lawyers that find out who owns what. And in some ways, maybe at some point, Google will overcome all of that and make everything that's published available. But not everything that's published is available electronically. So there's about 50%, would you say? How many books are not available in electronic form yet? It's hard to say.
Yeah, I'd guess around that. 50% are available on Google Books. Everything in that public access, public domain.
And they'll eventually get there.
Right.
But that raises the question again. So as librarians, would you say that we need a broader and stronger public domain? Should we roll back copyright in order to improve access to information?
Personally, I think that the more access to information that people have, that's the library's mission, right? Is to get people access to the information that they need. So if there's a way, I know the Hati Trust is working with Google Books to make sure that not only are they getting online, but there are proper archival processes in place so they're not getting lost once they are, right? There are lots of things to consider. You're not just going and scanning a book and putting it online and it's there. So Yeah, I think there's more to it than just making things digital. The more access we can provide to people, the better. And however that comes about, we want to set the information free, right?
Yeah.
That's what we think about in libraries.
And not just give it to Google either.
Right,
because
right.
that's not free, because that is a private institution. It's a private corporation, privately held by its shareholders, and that will come at a price.
Yes.
Even though you can Google it without paying money, it's still going to have advertising. It's still going to have some
Collect your
other
data, right?
yeah, that kind of thing. So that's one difference there between libraries and privatizing that function, I think. My next question for you is about books. And you said some portion, we don't know exactly the percentage, some portion of books are only available in print right now.
Mm-hmm.
So what do either of you or both of you think about the future of printed books? We have this nostalgic, many of us have this nostalgic connection to the physical object of the book, which is, by the way, one of the greatest technologies ever invented. And it's been persistent. Books will never go away. There will always be books. But do you think libraries need to maintain their print collections in order to still be libraries?
Well, I have an email from Sharon Gunkel, who is the school librarian at Nevis Public School.
Okay.
And I sent out an email to all of our libraries in the region yesterday, and they responded. And I just want to read to you quickly what
Sure.
Sharon said. Sharon Gunkel from Nevis Public School. While ebooks are wonderful and convenient, they do not replace print books. Research has shown that young children learn to read best when given print materials. Amazingly, many of my teen readers still say they prefer print to electronic books. Perhaps they spend enough time on devices and just want to settle in with a good print book. Meanwhile, the body of evidence regarding the health effects of too much screen time just keeps growing. Although the internet has put a world of information at students' fingertips, some of it is questionable content. In our modern world of misinformation, it is more important than ever that students learn how to evaluate the information that they find online. Effective librarians help them do this. So we help people find, good, research that's journal articles based on research, but we also help them find and determine what's information that's valid and information that is not valid. And I think working in the media, librarians share what the media is doing, which is finding facts. You find facts, you test those facts, you test them again, and then you're able to broadcast it, or you're able to publish it in the New York Times. We bring people to PBS, we bring people to the New York Times or to the Washington Post, because we know that journalists are doing their work in finding the facts. And we trust the fact that you're finding the facts.
Yeah, so back to the issue of printed books, I think that there's a real strong case to be made there, and I think it was made very well in the email. There's a real benefit to having that printed book. It's not just an obsolete technology, it's one that we should pay more attention to the benefits of. The immersivity, I guess you call it, of the printed book, right? Yeah. The fact that you don't have hyperlinks or buttons on the side that you can press. The fact that you can't just hold your finger on a word and get the definition. Right. Those give you mental option points at every stage that pull you out of the immersion in the text. And I think that it really happens. So is BSU going to maintain its print collections?
I think to an extent. I can't speak as much to the need for a print book in a children's library. I can see the good things that are happening there.
I think for an adult library.
Yeah,
too.
for an adult, I'd agree to some extent with that too. I see us going more digital because it just allows access at an easier clip. I don't think we'll ever get rid of the print collection. The students I work with, a lot of the times will be looking, oh, my professor required me to use a book, how dare they, for my research paper, right? And then we'll get up to the stacks and I'll be helping them find that book. And all of a sudden, an even better book shows up 4 books later because they have the ability to browse that shelf that, to this point, I don't think has been duplicated digitally in any good way. Maybe that's down the road.
No, the benefits of browsing in the stacks.
Serendipity.
Yeah. And I think there's a real case to be made there for maintaining, physical structures with printed books in them and the benefits of that, which I think a lot of funding bodies, governments and politicians and the administration sometimes might see that's an area, oh, you have a digital copy of it, why do we need to keep the heat on in this building?
Exactly.
which is a big struggle for all libraries, I'd imagine.
Oh, it is.
At the same time, I appreciate the value of the print book, but you're talking about the nostalgia of it, and there are books that need to go. We can't keep buying books and putting them on the shelves. Eventually, you'll run out of space, and libraries do go through and weed collections of maybe outdated or bad information from time to time too, and you know, deselecting those books and donating them or recycling them, people hear of that and they see that process as, oh my gosh, you're censoring, you're getting rid of these books in the collection. But it is a normal process that takes place to make sure those print collections are useful. Having every book published for a 10-year span isn't helpful to people. We want to curate a collection that is useful for our clientele.
Specifically.
Yeah. You say clientele, do you mean
Patrons.
students? Okay.
Patrons, yeah.
Clients. Reading a book online is different than reading it in paper as well. So when I'm reading text online, it's more difficult for me to look at it in a linear way. I look at it more in a circular way. So it's kind of a circular environment. And when I'm doing research or when I'm wanting to remember what I've read, paper is always useful to me because I can mark the book. I can mark the book and then I can go back in a linear way and reach it again. So in some ways, paper can be very, very helpful too. And children's books, you know, they're electronic, but there's the most beautiful art in children's books. It's just phenomenal. And then even the text in children's books is poetic so often.
Yeah.
And even young adults now are wanting paper again. And I think there's something, when I read online all day most of the time. And so when I get home in the evening, I really want to pick up a paper book and read it because I want my eyes to rest. And I find that using an and I'm not, you know, I was in the forefront of everything electronic and technologically oriented since the beginning of my time. But I really appreciate having a book that I can read and I can hand to a friend or I can give to somebody else and say, I really like this. One anecdote, and then I'll be done. I have one of our interns received a book from a former professor, and then she took the class from another professor, and it was all annotated and marked up, and it was really helpful to her when she took that class.
Yeah. Well, I mean, real quickly, that gets back to the intellectual property thing about it. One of the differences between a print book and a digital book is that you can share that print book with your friend or give it as a gift because it's an object that you own and can treat it however you want, or the library owns in that case.
Yes.
And that's not true. There's much more restriction on how you can use a digital file. Although it seems much more convenient, it actually is much more restricted in some ways.
It is.
Yeah. My next question for you two is about your particular libraries. As we've gone through these major, as I said at the beginning, upheavals in the last generation or so in the way media is treated across all platforms, libraries have had to adjust. So what is new in your libraries? If I came to either the Northern Lights libraries or the BSU library, how would it be different if I hadn't been there in 10 years or 15 years? What's going on?
Yeah, so at BSU, the most notable thing, if you hadn't been there and walked through the doors in 10 years, is we had a major renovation over the summer. And the main floor of our library went from having a lot of current periodicals and print, a lot of reference materials. We relocated a lot of those on that main floor to create more computer space and more collaborative space, and that's the same throughout the building. We're trying to think more of scholarship being a conversation, right? We're not just picking up materials, reading it, citing it in a paper, and setting it down. Having a conversation with those and going beyond just direct quotes out of materials is something that we're going for. And even having conversations and collaborating with the people in the library. Scholarship doesn't take place in a silo, and a lot of times you think of the library and it's this really quiet place. So the other thing you might notice when you walk through that door is there's a pretty good hum of people talking and those conversations taking place. And I think that's a good thing that our library has embraced.
And we've noticed something. I've been with Northern Lights Library Network for 8 years, and one thing that's happened throughout the region in school libraries is those libraries have closed. And so one thing you might see from 15 years ago to the present is a library that was intact and operational, and then a library that is closed and now in the process of reopening. So there are several libraries that I've been working with over the last 4 years to reopen libraries that had been closed. And the reason the schools are reopening them is because they're finding that everything isn't available on the internet and that their reading scores have gone down.
Yeah.
So, so for instance, the Perham schools closed their library and they put some books in a janitor's closet, and then they built a new school, this most amazingly beautiful facility, and they included a library space. So they had to repopulate that library, and they needed to know how to organize that library and how to check out the materials, and students are very excited to be able to check out materials. Circle of Life Academy closed their library, and I visited it several times. It was the most beautiful space. It had full-length windows facing a lake with stone pillars, and I would visit the librarian there, and children, the most beautiful children you ever want to see, were using that collection, and they had books. And then they closed the library, and now we're in the process of reopening it because reading scores dropped. And if you go into a library and you talk to a school librarian, they represent books, you know, and so books.
Yeah.
And if we don't get books into the hands of people, they're not going to be able to read well, and they're not going to be able to think critically and make informed decisions for themselves. And so libraries represent not only information, but knowledge and access to knowledge. And knowledge equates to literacy, and which equates to critical thinking and independent decision making. And we need more of that, not less of it.
Yeah. I think that all makes a very good argument for the continuation. And personally, I'm very happy to hear that libraries that were closed are reopening.
Mm-hmm.
That's something, that's a phenomenon I hadn't heard about before,
Mm-hmm.
but it gives me some heart that people had made these short-sighted decisions based, I'm assuming, on budgets and other things,
Yes.
looking at this,
Budgets.
without the bigger picture of what the function of education is
Mm-hmm.
and the central role that libraries play in that, both for the civic population, you know, the population of a community, but also for students as well. But what role do physical space? You mentioned, was it at the Perham Library, you said, or the
Yes.
Circle of Life Library?
Both
the big,
closed and they're
beautiful,
reopening. Yes, Circle
beautiful
of Life,
buildings.
beautiful.
There's something about the building space, the gathering space of a library. The word library means book place or something from Latin, bookstore. So I don't know that you could have a library without books in it, but what about the other functions of the library? What role does it have on campus? What role does it have in a community? I mean, I used to go to the Bemidji Public Library to vote, you know,
Yes.
and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, our library, it kind of boils, I think, of three things that libraries provide. That space that we're talking about for collaboration. The services that we provide are something that gets lost as well. We're thinking about helping students research at my institution. We're teaching them how to find information, how to evaluate information. And then the collection itself, we talked a little bit about the print collection there, but also our electronic resources and databases. But then we go beyond that. I'm excited to plug it a little bit. We're working on this really great community-wide reading event. We're partnering with the Bemidji Public Library, different tribal college libraries, the Bemidji High School, and we're bringing people together around one single book to have a community-wide book club, if you want to think of it that way. And we're having different programs and events around the area and bringing people together around one single text and being able to share that reading experience. There's something to be said about that too. Libraries aren't, if we think of libraries as dusty book warehouses, we're starting to get into trouble a little bit. There are numbers that point in academic libraries to decreasing print circulation. People are checking out less books, especially in academic libraries. That's a trend, and we're not necessarily fighting that. We want people to read books, but we're going beyond just those traditional library services as well.
And it's instructional as well, isn't
Yeah.
it? You do a lot of instruction,
Yeah.
which is to link students to the resources they need to do their research papers, but also to give the public and students and whomever is using the library access to the material that interests them the most. And you can do that with a Google search, but to actually access research is simply an information literacy process whereby somebody will let us know what they need and we will show them how to access not just information but knowledge. And then it's knowledge that can be used for somebody to learn it and maybe create a PowerPoint or to write a research paper or even to publish themselves. So that information literacy key is to bring people to knowledge and give them access to it. But it isn't something you can just do with a free Google search. It requires instruction.
There's something antithetical, I think, to the free Google search. Would you
Yes.
agree that the more reliant a person is upon that kind of thing, the less,
Yes.
I think it's kind of a paradox, right?
It
that
is.
the more access you have to that type of very easy information, the less skillful you become. You sort of outsourced that function of your brain to the algorithm
Exactly.
somewhere.
Right.
And so,
Start thinking the algorithm.
yeah, you have to internalize that kind of algorithm. But back to physical space, what about public libraries, of which many are the members of the Northern Lights? What other changes have you seen across the region, across things? What kinds of programs are libraries running that people might not be aware of?
Oh, I think central to all the public libraries is the book in whatever form. If it's a community read, if it's somebody who's in the library reading their poems, if it's children who are coming to Story Hour, there are just multiple community events. And thanks to the legacy funding from the Minnesota legislature, we're able to hold cultural events in libraries and bring authors in, and they can travel through the most remote regions where they wouldn't be able to otherwise. So legacy funding has been really wonderful for Minnesota libraries.
Yeah. Patrick, back to your community-wide book reading event.
Yeah.
Do you have any? Is there a book out there that people should be looking for?
Yeah, definitely. You can stop by our A.C. Clark Library at BSU or the Bemidji Public Library. We're reading The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich. We're really excited. It's a great title. We've got some funding through the National Endowment for the Arts, and we're also distributing copies of Bow Wow Pow Wow by Brenda Child to our patrons that are at that reading level, right? Our children patrons in the community. And we're hoping to bring Brenda Child up to do a reading at the public library, the author of the book, on October 26th. We're really excited about that. But there's a whole lot of events going on. Find us on Facebook. We have the whole list. We have a ton of great events scheduled, and we're hoping to bring together the entire community around this book, or the two books.
Yeah, will there be another one after that? Is this an ongoing event, or is this a one time?
We're not really sure yet. It might become an annual thing. I know there's been a lot of interest working with the tribal colleges in the area, the high school here in town, and the public library. The Watermark Art Center has been involved too, so we have a lot of cool stuff. We're not sure if it'll be annual. I don't want to promise that yet, but it's definitely something we're considering. The important part is we want to find a book that's relevant to our community. We don't want to just pick any old book and have everybody come around it. We want to be intentional about that. So that's something we're considering too.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for joining me today. And thank you at home for joining us on Lakeland Currents. We'll see you next week.